I'm Effie Barker. We are right here in downtown Los Angeles. A student of Cal State University Northridge died while on a hike. We all want to enhance our look before we take a photo. When you say we're not going away with these issues, what are those issues? He's the son of the labor union leader, Cesar Chavez, attorney Fernando Chavez. What would you think would be Cesar Chavez think of the politics of immigration of today?
Well, I think he'd be appalled.
What was the goal to put out the Larry Itliong Day?
My goal was just to bring out the true history, the historical fact.
Good evening. Welcome to the special edition of Ugnayan. I'm Effie Barker. Hello, welcome to Effie Barker Human Interest. Today we are going to talk about how we are going to come out in this pandemic. We will also discuss the UK government's response to the pandemic, the reopening of the schools, how soon is everything going to reopen, and are we ever able to go back to normal? Joining us today is a molecular microbiologist from the University of Bath. He focuses on infectious diseases, particularly on the respiratory tract and microbial evolution and adaptation, Dr. Andrew Preston. Hello, Andrew. Thank you for coming to our show. I know you're very busy.
No, absolute pleasure. Thank you, Effie.
Andrew, tomorrow schools in England will reopen after months of enforced homeschooling. I know you were testing all week, right? Talk to us, how effective are these lateral flow tests that are going to be implemented in schools? It has been reportedly notorious for inaccurate results. And the big question is that many are asking is that, are the children safe now to go back to school?
As you say, an area of much debate over the last week or so. So the lateral flow tests that are being used, they have some pros and some cons, like most of the tests, in fact. So no test is 100% perfect. The pros for this particular test, of course, it can be self-administered. You get a result within 30 minutes, and you need no specialist equipment. So this is not a lab-based test, which makes it hugely portable and, of course, very high throughput. Of course, one of the downsides for this is that it lacks the sensitivity of the PCR-based test. So we think that could miss maybe 30, in some studies, perhaps as many as 50% of those people that are actually carrying the virus. However, of course, one of the issues with the PCR test is that it's been deemed overly sensitive and that it can pick up the remnants of an infection that may have actually ceased to be a risk to others weeks and weeks ago. So it's about trying to find that balance. So it's not being used to say to somebody that you are infection-free and therefore do not need to take any precautions. But what it does do is if it comes up positive, of course, that's an indication that you're probably carrying the virus and that you should isolate. And because, again, these are being used primarily on people with no symptoms at all, these are people who would otherwise not be getting tested. And so the idea, of course, is that we're actually able to weed out a number of pupils, in this case in the schools, who would otherwise be restarting their classes over the next week or so and would be unwittingly taking the virus into their classroom and possibly infecting their classmates.
So what happens if a pupil or a student gets a positive results? What happens to the people that they hang out or their friends, were their friends in isolate as well?
So at the moment, of course, they shouldn't be hanging out with anybody because we're still under lockdown and the reopening of schools is just the first phase tomorrow. But all of the other restrictions about interacting with others will remain in effect for a few weeks yet. So the idea, of course, is that we pick up any positives, those people, and they have to isolate for 10 days. Now, one of the controversies about this is that there is no further confirmatory tests despite some of the qualms over the lateral flow test. So I think it possibly could be made more robust by if you pick up a positive during your school test with your lateral flow device, that you then go home and call for sort of a definitive PCR test. Because again, some people are concerned that just this one-off test may actually give a few false positives, and we'd have some pupils isolating for 10 days who might actually not be carrying the virus. But then, at the population level, if you think all of the kids going back to school, is it so bad if we have a few pupils, maybe inconvenienced for 10 further days, considering they've just been off for another 2-3 months? Is it so bad compared to having children unwittingly take the infection into the classroom and potentially infecting many more children?
So I take it from what you've said that when they get a positive result, they would take a test again at home. Is that the PCR that we use when you go to a center?
So actually, at the moment, there is no requirement. So the lateral flow test is being regarded as definitive. So a positive test in the lateral flow test at school is a straight isolation for 10 days. It'll be interesting over the next couple of weeks as this debate builds. It wouldn't surprise me if the government changed their stance and say, well, actually, we're going to get relatively small numbers of positives with the lateral flow devices, and therefore it's no great burden on the system for those people to go home and call for a PCR test. And I think that would give greater reassurance and greater robustness to the whole program.
Okay. Now, the next question that many are asking, how soon is everything going to open up? If the curve is already flattened, then why are we still not opening up? I mean, there's a lot of people were expecting that when Boris Johnson came on TV, that it'll be a good news on the 8th of March. And there are already 21 million people that have been vaccinated in the UK. But it seems that every time the government code talk about the exit plans, it seems that we're moving a little farther and farther away. When are we really going back to normal? Is it next month, next year? Or?
Well, we're going back to normal step by step. So the UK has learned some painful lessons over the last year. We've had 2 prior lockdowns, and in each case, we've done a pretty rapid easing of restrictions. And of course, that means that so we've had very little opportunity to really study the effect of opening each sector, whether it be schools, retail, hospitality, sports facilities. So here we're actually opening schools first. There'll be a pause then of 4 to 5 weeks, which gives us a chance to actually see what effect this has. And obviously, that will then influence the further easing of restrictions. So we've got about a 5-weekly interval between each phase of reopening, with more and more sort of different sectors being reopened each time. And of course, that gives us really important information for in the future about what is the actual contribution each of these different sectors to transmission. But importantly, of course, it gives us the opportunity to pick up those signals that if the infection rate starts to climb again, it's not going to be as large an effect as if everything opened up. And of course, that makes it easier to put the brakes back on again. So to some people, I think they're saying it's too slow, but actually the infection levels are still quite high in the UK. We've still got many thousands of new cases per day. It's declining really quite quickly, but it's going to take a long time to get back down to 0. So my view, this is a pragmatic phased reopening. Probably the timing's as good as we're going to get, balancing that need to kickstart economy and people's lives, while still being cautious whilst there's still, noticeable levels of infection around.
In January in Sky News, you warned that lifting the lockdown due to small drop in cases is incredibly dangerous. The question is, what are the criteria of opening up? The latest data shows that there were 6,000 new cases and the 158 deaths. I think this was yesterday when I saw it. And so if the decline of number of cases is not a criteria, then what is? And at what point are we able to see normal life, or do we ever be able to?
Gosh, well, that's the big question, isn't it? I think we'll see a return to near normality. That near normality may be, as the phrase is, learning to live with COVID. I do think that of course, the big game changer now are the vaccines. These have proved to be far more effective than I think any of us had dared hope for. So if we get, rewind back to last summer, we didn't even know whether we would be able to vaccinate at all against this infection. Now we have an increasing number of vaccines that actually, even looking at the data in the real world, so in their use in the wider population, the levels of protection against the really serious forms of COVID, so severe disease, hospitalization, and of course deaths, those levels of protection are remarkably high. So that gives us great confidence that even if once we reopen, we start to see infection rebound, it's not going to be putting people in hospital or killing them. And of course, that gives us that great confidence. And then that gives us the opportunity to have a think about what we need to do to keep that protection level in the future. So this is talking about obviously the vaccination passports and the next generation of vaccines that have been tweaked, as we say here, to deal with the variants that arise over the next couple of years. So the vaccines certainly have changed the situation compared to when we've been coming out of previous lockdowns over the last 12 months.
Now, talking about vaccines, Can you talk to us about the controversy about the dosing effectiveness during the developing of the testing phase of AstraZeneca? And now there have been further questions about the effectiveness of the vaccine.
Sure. So actually, it wasn't necessarily the dosing or the gap between the first and second dose for AstraZeneca that was the big controversy. It was really the fact we applied the same longer gap between the first and second dose to the Pfizer vaccine as well. So back when the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was in its phase 3 efficacy trials, and these took place in a number of different countries, due to issues over the supply of the vaccine during those very early stages, actually quite a few participants in those trials had varying gaps between their first and second doses. And some of them were right up to around 84, 90 days between their first and second dose. And that was the data that suggested to us that not only could you extend the gap way beyond the ordinary 3 weeks that we expect for vaccines, not only could you extend that gap up to 12 weeks, but in fact the efficacy, so the protection that you got after your second dose, seemed to be higher after extending that gap compared to perhaps vaccinating just 3 weeks apart. So the UK was in the midst of a really frightening situation when that decision was made. We had skyrocketing cases. We had very large numbers of people going into hospital each day, and our death toll was climbing considerably. So this was a really pragmatic response, I think, driven as much by the situation as well as the data, showing that perhaps immunity from one dose was going to give you most of the protection that you got from the vaccine, and that by extending that gap, there was no diminishment in the protection you got between them. Of course, there was no data for the Pfizer vaccine, but actually there was data from just looking at the immune response in people, and it was quite clear that the measurable immune response, so particularly the antibodies that those people had, didn't suddenly die down, didn't suddenly die off at 21 days. And there was evidence that actually those antibodies remained pretty high right up through to the gap that we're now using. And as it turns out, maybe it was a little bit of a roll of the dice, but again, I would caution that it was in the response to a pretty dire situation. It actually looks to have paid off. As you say, we've got very high numbers of people now have had one vaccine dose. Our hospitalization rates are dropping all of the time now. And so, the more vaccine we roll out, the greater that level of protection we see. So it looks as if it's paid off, I think.